400 people in the room, all of them watching. A woman in a black dress raises her hand, and the sound that follows stops every conversation in that ballroom cold. Not a gasp, not a shout. Just one sharp crack, cutting through 400 people performing happiness, and then 3 seconds of total silence that feels longer than 3 seconds ever should. The man standing there doesn't move, doesn't flinch, doesn't reach for his face. He reaches into his pocket, not for a phone, not for keys. Something smaller, something he'd been carrying all evening, waiting for exactly this moment. He sets it on the table beside him, quietly. The way you set down something you've been holding for a very long time. The woman who slapped him is already turning away. The man beside her is smiling. Neither of them knows what's walking through the doors behind them. Neither of them knows who he actually is. The coffee was hot. That was the first thing Anthony Wilson noticed every morning. Not the market reports loading on the second monitor, not the pre-dawn quiet pressing against the kitchen windows, just the coffee. Dark, no sugar, exactly 210 degrees if he measured it, which he did not, but somehow it was always right. He sat at the kitchen table with the mug in his right hand and the laptop open in front of him. 5:17 in the morning. Atlanta still dark outside. The neighborhood not awake yet, just the sound of somebody's sprinkler system 3 houses down doing its slow, patient rotation. He scrolled through overnight reports the way other men scrolled through sports scores, positions, allocations. A note from his fixed income team about a rebalancing he'd flagged Tuesday. Nothing urgent, nothing that needed him to move fast. Real money didn't move fast. Real money was patient and methodical, and sometimes so quiet people forgot it existed. That was the point. The kitchen around him looked like every other kitchen on the block. White tile that had yellowed a little at the grout lines. A refrigerator with a small dent near the bottom handle from when they'd moved it themselves 6 years ago. Instead of just paying movers like a normal couple. A window above the sink that looked out on the backyard where the fence needed a fresh coat of paint, and he kept meaning to do it, and kept deciding it could wait another season. From the outside, the whole house said comfortable. Middle of the road. A man who was doing okay, that was also the point. His truck sat in the driveway, a Ford F-150, 2018, 91,000 miles. A small rust spot above the rear left wheel well that he noticed every time he backed out and felt no particular urgency to address. The laptop on the table had a hairline crack in the bottom left corner of the screen. Had been there 8 months. He'd looked at replacements twice and closed the browser both times. There was a room at the end of the hall Sandra called his little office. She said it the way people say things that are meant to communicate a larger point. His little office. Like the size of the room was evidence of something. Like the 12 by 14-foot space with 2 monitors and a locked filing cabinet and a direct line to the legal and accounting teams at Wilson Capital Partners was a hobby room. A man cave. A place he retreated to feel important in his head while the real world happened elsewhere. She'd never opened the door and asked what he was actually doing in there. Not once. Not in 14 years. Wilson Capital Partners managed $480 million in assets across 8 portfolio companies. Anthony had started it with $2 million, borrowed from 3 people, including his mother, 11 years ago. There was no logo on the door of the actual office, which was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. No receptionist in the lobby. No mentions in any business journal. No profile pages, no LinkedIn presence beyond a minimal placeholder that told you almost nothing. Anthony had made those choices deliberately and kept making them every year. He was 43 years old. He had never needed anyone to know what he was. The sound that announced Sandra was not the alarm. It was the heels. She had a way of putting on shoes before she came downstairs that he'd noticed somewhere around year 4 of their marriage. Sharp click on the hardwood of the second floor. Then the landing, then the stairs, a little softer on carpet, then the kitchen floor again. Click, click, click. 7:43. She came in wearing a blazer he had never seen before. Deep burgundy, fitted close at the waist, the kind of thing that cost money and was designed to say so without announcing it. Her earrings were small gold drops. Also new. Her perfume arrived slightly before she did, something warm and unfamiliar that sat in the kitchen air after she passed. Anthony said, "Morning." She opened the refrigerator, stared into it for 4 seconds, closed it without taking anything. She picked up her keys from the counter. He looked up from the laptop. "You eating anything?" "I'll get something at the office." She was already checking her phone, thumb moving fast across the screen. A small expression crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Something she caught and flattened before it finished forming. He watched her. "Long day?" "They're all long days, Anthony." She said it without looking up. The front door opened, closed behind her. Not a slam, just a click, soft and final. The same sound as every other door in this house, except this one always landed differently, and he could not have explained exactly why, just that it did. He sat with his coffee. Outside, he heard the Audi back out of the driveway, the sound of it pulling away, getting smaller and then gone. He noted it the way he noted everything, filed it, went back to work. The souring hadn't happened like a single thing breaking. It happened the way a road develops potholes. Not from one event, but from weather and pressure and time and small damage accumulating. Until one day you're looking at something you can no longer drive smoothly across, no matter how carefully you go. 2 years ago, little comments that each seemed reasonable in isolation. My coworker's husband just made partner. Reasonable. She was proud of her colleague. Fine. Don't you want something bigger than this? Reasonable. Ambition was healthy. Fine. I just thought we'd be further along by now. That one landed heavier. He'd let it sit. Didn't push back. Thought about it for 2 weeks, and then filed it in the category of things people say when they're tired that they don't entirely mean. Except she kept meaning it. A year and a half ago, she got promoted to Senior Director of Marketing at Vanguard Creative Group, a media company headquartered in Midtown Atlanta, mid-size, doing well. Her new boss was a man named James Carter. CEO, she mentioned him within the first week. Then again 2 weeks after that. Then regularly in a way that had a different quality from how she talked about coworkers she respected versus coworkers she found impressive. He'd noticed the distinction. He had not said anything about the distinction. The late nights started 8 months ago, once a week. Then twice. By the time he'd fully registered the pattern, it was 4 nights out of 7, and the explanations had started arriving only when he asked, which meant he was asking more than he used to, and she was answering less than she used to. And somewhere in the middle of that arithmetic, something had changed irrevocably. He couldn't point to the day. That was the thing about 14 years. You couldn't point to the day. His mother saw it before he let himself. Lorraine Wilson was 71 years old, and had the particular quality of small women who had lived through large things. She took up less physical space than you expected, but left more of a mark than anyone twice her size. Silver hair that she kept natural. Eyes that moved over a room quickly and quietly and forgot nothing they'd seen. 2 Sundays before the morning with the burgundy blazer, they'd had dinner at her house in South Atlanta. Pot roast, too much salt, the same floral tablecloth she'd had since Anthony was in high school. Sandra sat across from him and spent the majority of the meal looking at her phone under the edge of the table, like a teenager who had somewhere better to be and was trying not to make it obvious. She was not making it unobvious. Lorraine watched her from the head of the table for a long time, not staring, just present. The way Lorraine watched everything with the stillness of someone who had already decided that souls in life, that most things in life could be figured out if you just gave them enough quiet attention. When Sandra excused herself to take a call outside, Lorraine set her fork down on the edge of her plate. Anthony, her voice had the same weight as when he was 12 and had done something she already knew about. "Mama, there is something wrong with your marriage." She said it, the way she said things that were facts, without inflection, without drama. "Mama, I'm not asking you what I see." She picked her fork back up. "Do with it what you want." He told her she was reading into things. He told himself the same thing the whole drive home. Sandra was stressed at work. James Carter ran a demanding operation. Long hours weren't unusual in that world. He almost believed it. 4 nights later, he found the charge. He was sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, laptop open to the shared bank account. Routine. He did this every 2 weeks. Went through the charges the way he read any financial document, methodically, line by line, not rushing, letting the numbers tell their own story. He almost scrolled past it. The Harrington Hotel. $312. Posted Thursday. Thursday was the night Sandra had told him she was working late. Anthony stared at the screen. He read it again and again. He closed the laptop, put both hands flat on the table, sat without moving for a long time. Then he stood, carried his mug to the sink, rinsed it, set it in the drying rack, turned off the kitchen light, went upstairs, lay down in the dark next to his wife, who was already asleep facing away from him, and he stared at the ceiling and let the number sit in his chest like a stone and breathed steadily around it. He did not say anything. Not that night. Not the next morning when Sandra came downstairs in another new blouse and left again without eating. Not the day after that when she texted at 6:30 to say she'd be late and he wrote back okay and meant it as a period at the end of something, but did not say so out loud. He made dinner for one, ate it slowly, washed the dishes himself, and 2 days after finding the charge, he made a call. Terry Coleman's office was above a tax preparation shop on the east side of the city. No sign on the door. No website you'd find by accident. Terry came recommended by Harold Reed, who had been Anthony's attorney for 12 years and handled the quieter legal matters for Wilson Capital with the kind of deliberate discretion that Anthony had come to value more than almost any other professional quality. Harold had said 3 things about Terry Coleman when he gave Anthony the number. He's thorough, he doesn't talk, and he was a cop for 18 years, so he knows what actually matters. That was enough. Anthony met Terry once, in person, for under 15 minutes. Terry was 52, medium build, the kind of face that had been outdoors enough to weather but not enough to age prematurely. He asked questions in a way that suggested he already knew the answers and was just checking your version against his. Anthony told him what he wanted, movement only, locations, times, who she met, photos if there were meetings. 1 week. Terry said, "Anything else you want?" "Nothing else." Terry nodded once. The meeting was over. Anthony drove back to the office, feeling nothing in particular except a specific kind of heaviness that was not grief yet, but was in the same general territory as grief, the feeling of standing at the edge of something you can't walk back from once you step into it. The 4 days that followed had a strange double quality. On the surface, he was exactly where he always was. His morning routine, his calls with the portfolio team, a lunch meeting Tuesday with a private equity contact he'd been cultivating for 2 years. Dinner at his mother's on Wednesday, where Lorraine served chicken and dumplings, and watched him with careful eyes and did not push, which was one of the things he loved most about her. She knew when not to push. Underneath the surface, everything had a different texture. He watched Sandra in the mornings with new attention. Not suspicious attention, the wrong word for it. More like the attention you gave something you'd been too familiar with to actually see clearly, and were now seeing with the kind of focus that felt almost clinical. The new earrings. The energy she arrived in the kitchen with. The phone, always the phone. The way she angled it slightly away from him, even in rooms where he wasn't close enough to see anything. She was lighter lately, almost cheerful in a way that had nothing to do with him or their shared life. She hummed in the bathroom while she got ready. She slept facing the wall every night, which she had done for months. But now he noticed it differently, catalogued it differently, filed it away alongside everything else he was accumulating, with the cold patience of a man who had trained himself never to move until he knew exactly what he was dealing with. He had learned that in business at significant cost, early on. Before Wilson Capital had found its footing, he'd made 2 decisions based on incomplete information. Both of them had cost him. One had cost him considerably. The lesson had seared in. You do not act on what you suspect. You act on what you can prove. Everything before that is just noise, and noise was the most expensive thing in his professional life. He was applying that discipline now to the most personal situation he'd ever faced. He was not sure whether that was wisdom or avoidance. He suspected it was both. Terry's report came on day 4. A plain email, no subject line. 2 attachments, photos and notes. Anthony opened them at his desk with the door locked and his phone face down and no music playing. The photos were clear, good light, steady camera, exactly what he'd asked for. First image, Sandra and a man in a parking garage, her body angled toward him, his hand at the small of her back, the body language of 2 people who had been in each other's space long enough for it to feel normal. Second image outside a restaurant called Cassell's, the kind of place that did not print prices on the menu. The man had his hand on the door of a black Porsche Cayenne, holding it open while Sandra got in, and the whole thing had the choreography of a habit. Third image, the exterior of the Harrington Hotel. Both of them walking in at 8:22 in the evening through a side entrance, the kind of entrance someone used when they knew the layout, when they'd been there before, when they had specific reasons for not walking through the main lobby. The man, tall, mid-40s, good suit, dark navy, fitted well, cuffed links. The kind of posture that came from being told repeatedly that he was impressive, and eventually believing it as a baseline fact about himself rather than something he had to maintain. Wide shoulders, a jaw that photographed well, the easy movement of someone who had rarely been in a room where he wasn't one of the most visually prominent figures. Terry's notes were direct. According to a contact inside Vanguard Creative Group, someone who talked more than they realized, this man had been telling Sandra things. That he was worth significant money, that he had a real estate portfolio and investment interests outside of his salary, that he intended to end his marriage, and when that happened he would take care of her properly. The kind of phrase that meant different things depending on who was saying it and why. He'd been saying it for months. Anthony read that part twice. He felt it in his chest as a specific kind of weight. The pressure of understanding something he could not unfeel. That the person he had shared his life with for 14 years had looked at what he'd built and called it inadequate. Had looked at him and seen not enough, and had walked toward a man who was making promises with someone else's expectations as the only collateral. He sat with that for exactly as long as he allowed himself to. Then he set it aside and looked at the name in Terry's notes. James Carter. He knew that name, not from Sandra's work stories. Not from the mentions of Vanguard that came up in dinner conversation. He knew it from somewhere else. Somewhere that had nothing at all to do with Sandra. And it took him about 45 seconds of sitting very still to locate exactly where. He opened the secure investor portal on his second monitor. Logged in with two-factor authentication. Navigated past the main dashboard, opened the folder marked Portfolio Holdings Active, typed Vanguard Creative Group. The results loaded. Anthony did not move. Wilson Capital Partners LP, controlling interest 51%, acquisition date June 2020, status active. He owned the company, not a minority position, not a passive stake sitting in some corner of a spreadsheet getting reviewed twice a year. The controlling interest, the majority. He owned the company that James Carter ran. He owned the company that James Carter worked in every day. The company that employed Sandra. The company from which James Carter drew a salary that went into a bank account that was ultimately subject to the oversight of Anthony Wilson's fund. He pulled up the executive compensation file. James Carter's base salary, $290,000, standard performance bonus structure. Company car allowance. Anthony looked at the photo of the Porsche Cayenne. He looked at the restaurant with no prices on the menu. He looked at his own bank account record on the other monitor, the Harrington Hotel. $312. $290 base plus bonus. He did the math in his head the way he did everything, quickly and without sentiment. The number did not produce the Cayenne. It did not produce the restaurant. It did not produce the New York trip Sandra had mentioned. Or the jewelry or the lifestyle that was apparently being described as evidence of someone building something real. The numbers didn't match the life. Anthony leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingertips together in front of his face. There was a layer underneath the layer. There always was, when the numbers didn't add up. That was one of the first things he'd learned when he started doing this work. The surface always lies a little. Not because everyone is dishonest, but because surfaces are built to be seen, not examined. When something looks too good and the numbers say it shouldn't, you don't shrug and move on. You go looking for what's holding the surface up. He was going to have to look. He closed the compensation file, closed the portfolio portal, sat in the dark of his office for a moment, and looked at his own hands resting on the desk. Then he picked up the phone and called Harold Reed. Harold answered on the second ring. It's late. Not unfriendly. Just noting it the way Harold noted everything, without drama, the voice of a man who had decided decades ago that nothing was worth the energy of alarm. I know. Anthony kept his voice even. I need to talk through something. A short pause. The sound of movement, a door closing, Harold giving himself privacy. Go ahead. I'm here. Anthony told him everything, not with the weight of it in his voice. Not with the thing he'd been carrying for 4 days bleeding through the words. He laid it out the way he'd present any deal in front of his team. The facts in sequence. The Harrington charge. The decision to bring in Terry. Terry's photos, what they showed, who the man was. The name cross-referenced with the portfolio holdings. The compensation gap that didn't produce the life. Harold listened without interrupting. He had known Anthony since Anthony was 31 years old and had $2 million and an investment thesis that sounded either visionary or reckless, depending on who was evaluating it. Harold had been one of the people willing to evaluate it carefully, and he had been in Anthony's corner through everything that followed. He understood, better than most, the difference between Anthony performing calm and Anthony actually being calm, and right now he understood he was hearing both at once, which told him more about the severity of the situation than any emotional display would have. When Anthony finished, Harold was quiet for a moment. How do you want to handle the financial piece? I want to know where the money is coming from. Anthony looked at the dark window across the room. He's living a life his salary doesn't explain. That's either debt or it's coming from somewhere inside the company. Either way, I have the right to know. I own the company. I can structure a forensic audit through the investor relations channel, Harold said. Routine due diligence framing. Callaway sends requests like that every 18 months. His team won't flag it. That's what I want. I'll use Kathleen Robinson, forensic accountant. She handled the Meridian case 2 years ago. Precise, discreet, no wasted motion. How long? 2 weeks for anything solid. 3 for airtight. Give it what it needs. I don't want gaps. Harold paused. When he spoke again, his voice had that careful, horizontal quality it got when he was asking something he needed answered, but knew had to be asked gently. And the personal side of this. Are you managing it? I'm fine, a beat. Harold accepted that. I'll file the audit request first thing tomorrow. Framed as standard review. His team won't have a reason to push back. Good. Anthony. A pause. Whatever we find, we'll handle it right. I know we will, he meant it. Thank you, Harold. He ended the call and set the phone face down on the desk and sat with the quiet of the office for a while. The city moving outside through the frosted glass window the way cities move at night, indifferent to any individual story, full of its own motion. He thought about 14 years. He thought about a woman who had looked at the same life he looked at every day and seen completely different things. A used truck, a modest house, a little office at the end of the hall. She had looked at those things and assembled a story about who he was, that she was so certain about. She had stopped asking questions a long time ago. He had let that happen. He knew that. He was not interested in pretending otherwise, in constructing a version of events where he was entirely blameless. He had built his whole professional life around the practice of not needing external validation, not needing anyone to see what he was doing or confirm that it mattered, and he had applied that same practice to his marriage, without ever stopping to ask whether that was wisdom or just a different kind of wall. Sandra had needed him to let her in. He had not let her in. He had not done it out of malice. He had done it out of habit, out of a way of moving through the world that felt like self-sufficiency but had, somewhere along the line, become something else. Something closer to isolation that he had dressed up in the language of discipline. He recognized it now. He was not sure what to do with that recognition except hold it, which was what he did with most things he couldn't immediately fix. The 10 days that followed had a strange double quality. On the surface, nothing changed. Anthony kept his routine. Market opens at 6:30, he was already at his desk, portfolio calls. A site visit to a company in the industrial segment he'd been watching. Dinner with his mother on Wednesday where she served baked chicken and didn't push him about anything, which was its own form of communication from Lorraine. Her way of saying I see you, and I'll wait. Sandra moved through the house with the energy of a woman who had already decided something and was living in the gap between the decision and the announcement. Lighter in a way that had a specific quality, the lightness of relief rather than happiness. The feeling of someone who had been holding a weight they were about to put down. She hummed. She slept facing away. She left early and came home late, and the explanations were brief and tidy, and had that rehearsed quality, the particular smoothness of a story that had been told enough times internally to feel like the truth. Anthony watched all of it, said nothing. Underneath the surface, Kathleen Robinson was moving through Vanguard Creative Group's books with the quiet, complete attention of a woman who had spent 20 years learning to read what numbers were actually saying versus what someone wanted them to say. She started outside. Public filings, annual reports, anything accessible through Wilson Capital's standard investor access. She built the exterior picture first, what the company presented to the world, before she went inside. When the formal audit request went through and Vanguard's accounting team opened access, she went inside. Kathleen's first report came on a Thursday afternoon. Harold forwarded it with a message that said only, "Call me after you've read this." Anthony read it at his desk, door locked, 9:15 at night. The structure was clean once you understood what you were looking at, and Kathleen had laid it out so that it built logically, each piece connecting to the next, so that by the time you reached the conclusion you had assembled it yourself, rather than having someone hand it to you. An entity named Blackridge Advisory Services LLC appeared in Vanguard's vendor payment records starting 16 months ago. Delaware registration. No physical address on file. No employees registered. No evidence of any actual services rendered to Vanguard Creative Group in the 16-month window during which Vanguard had paid them. Payments from Vanguard to Blackridge had started small, $7,000, then $11,000, then $14,000, then larger batches broken into pieces that were timed with obvious calculation. Amounts that sat just below the automatic flagging thresholds banks used for unusual transaction reporting. Time to fall in the window between Vanguard's internal review cycles. From Blackridge, the money moved again, into a personal account registered to James Carter. Kathleen had traced 16 months of this. The total was $387,000. Anthony read the number twice. Then he looked at the itemized list Kathleen had attached. She'd gone further than the transfers themselves. She'd cross-referenced the amounts with downstream spending patterns. And the picture she'd built was specific and unambiguous. Restaurant receipts charged to company entertainment accounts. Several of them from a place called Cassell's. Hotel charges. A purchase from a jewelry boutique on Peachtree. Car service. A weekend rental property in Savannah filed as a vendor relations event. He was almost at the bottom of the itemized list when he stopped. He looked at a specific line, looked at it for a moment, then opened a second window and pulled up the shared bank account. He put the two documents side by side on his monitors. Left monitor, Kathleen's itemized list. Right monitor, the bank account he had reviewed 2 weeks ago. The one with the charge that started all of this, the Harrington Hotel. $312. Thursday. It was in Kathleen's log. Not just a matching amount, not a coincidence. A direct trace. The charge had been routed through a Blackridge vendor code, buried inside a batch of falsified client entertainment expenses. Kathleen had flagged it without knowing what it was to him personally. To her, it was just another entry in a 16-month pattern of fraud. To Anthony, it was the exact charge he had found in his own account, the one he had stared at alone in the dark kitchen and said nothing about. The one that had sent him to Terry Coleman, and from Terry Coleman to a parking garage photo, and from there to this room, this document, this number, $312. He had paid for that night, not directly, not knowingly, but the money had come from a fund he controlled, passed through a shell company into the pocket of a man who used it to take his wife to a hotel room, and the financial architecture of that fact was so specific and so complete and so traceable that it existed in a legal document now, signed and notarized, waiting to be used. Anthony set both hands flat on the desk. The weight he had been carrying since he found the charge had shifted into something different now. Heavier in some ways, cleaner in others. The ambiguity was gone. All of it was documented, itemized, confirmed. He sat with it for 60 seconds. Then he picked up the phone. Harold answered fast. Anthony could tell from the quality of the silence, before Harold spoke, that he had already read it himself, had already done his own version of sitting with it, and was waiting to find out how Anthony was going to come at this. Page 6, Anthony said. Third section from the bottom. I know which page. A beat saw it. I saw it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. This changes the exposure, Harold said, carefully. In the register he used when the legal implications were serious, and he wanted Anthony tracking that. As controlling partner, you have direct standing. I know. Anthony looked at the window. The seat side was doing its indifferent nighttime motion. We're not waiting. I need 3 things ready before the end of next week. Tell me. Termination documentation for James Carter. The criminal referral packet for the D's office, ready to go the morning after. And I need to know whether Vanessa Carter is someone we can work with. A pause. The CFFO. She's been sitting inside those books for what, a year and a half? If Kathleen found this in 2 weeks with outside access, Vanessa found some version of it from the inside. She's either complicit or she's been sitting on it and waiting. Either way, I need to know which one. She's not in any of the transfer chains, Harold said. Kathleen looked specifically. Then she's been sitting on it. Anthony said it without satisfaction. Find out if she'll talk. Don't push. Just find out. How do you want to approach her? Through Terry first. Have him watch her routine. See if there's something in her behavior that tells us where she is with it. Then you approach, not me. If she's carrying what I think she's carrying, she's going to be cautious. And the first conversation matters. Understood. Harold paused. And the personal side. Sandra is going to be there. Sandra is always somewhere, Anthony said. His voice was steady. Completely steady. That's not a variable. That's just a fact. He ended the call, closed both monitors, sat in the dark of his little office at the end of the hall, and let the quiet settle around him. Outside, a car passed. Somebody's dog barked once and stopped. The sprinkler 3 houses down was still doing its slow, patient rotation. He thought about Lorraine at the dinner table 2 weeks ago. Her fork going down, the way she said his name. He thought about Sandra humming in the bathroom that morning. The specific lightness of someone who had already made a decision and was living in the relief of it. He thought about 14 years, the fence that needed painting, the truck with the rust spot he kept not fixing, the laptop with the cracked corner, the little office at the end of the hall. He thought about a man in a good suit driving a car that a salary of $290,000 did not produce, making promises with other people's money as the foundation, taking someone who had decided he wasn't enough to a hotel room that was documented in a fraud log, paid for with capital that flowed through a fund with Anthony Wilson's name on it. He thought about all the things he had not said in 14 years, not out of deception, not out of arrogance, out of a particular form of self-sufficiency that had, somewhere in the long middle of a marriage, crossed a line into something that left the person beside him with too much silence to fill, and not enough information to fill it with anything real. He was going to have to sit with that. There was no documentation that fixed it, no audit that accounted for it, no termination that addressed it. It was just a thing he had done slowly, over a long time, and it had contributed to a woman he loved, or had loved, deciding that the story she'd assembled from the silence was more accurate than asking him for the real one. He sat with it. He breathed. Then he opened the laptop, pulled up the portfolio review he hadn't finished, and went back to work. Because the work was still there. The market would open in 9 hours. 3 of his portfolio companies had calls scheduled before noon. A decision about a new allocation in the industrial segment needed to be made by end of week. None of that stopped because his marriage was ending. None of it stopped because he was carrying something heavy. The work was patient, and the work was real, and the work had never once asked him to prove he was worth its attention. He had built it that way on purpose. He stayed at his desk until just before 2 in the morning. Then he closed the laptop, rinsed his mug, and walked through the dark house to the bedroom where Sandra was asleep facing the wall. He lay down in the dark. He did not say anything. He stared at the ceiling and let everything he knew settle into its proper weight. And somewhere in the careful stillness of that, he made a decision that felt less like deciding, and more like arriving somewhere he'd been walking toward for a long time without fully acknowledging the direction. The numbers were real. The documentation was complete. The plan was in motion. Whatever came next was going to come next on his terms, at his pace, with the full weight of everything he'd built and everything he knew behind it. He closed his eyes. Outside, the sprinkler kept its quiet, patient rotation in the dark. Sandra left on a Saturday. She had arranged everything before she told him it was happening. which told him more about the state of their marriage than anything she could have said out loud. The moving company arrived at 9 in the morning, 2 men with a truck and a hand dolly, and the practiced efficiency of people who spent their days inside other people's endings. Sandra directed them with the easy authority of someone who had been mentally living somewhere else for long enough that the physical part felt like paperwork. Anthony stayed out of the way. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, watched through the window as furniture moved through the front door in the wrong direction, out instead of in, and told himself this was information. And information was useful, and useful things did not require an immediate emotional response. The dresser, the armchair from the bedroom corner she'd picked out in year 2 of their marriage at a shop in Buckhead that no longer existed, a lamp, 3 boxes of things he couldn't identify from this distance. He watched and drank his coffee, and noted that she had not taken the kitchen table. The movers broke for water around 11. That was when Sandra came inside. She moved through the kitchen the way she'd been moving through it for months. Like a woman passing through a space that had already stopped belonging to her in any way that mattered. Her eyes went around the room once, taking inventory without sentiment. The way you looked at a rental when you were deciding whether to leave a review. They landed on Anthony briefly, then moved away. I left the guest room furniture. Her voice was even and somewhat careful, the tone of someone being deliberately reasonable. Figured you'd want something when your mother visits. I appreciate that. She opened the cabinet above the refrigerator, took 2 things she'd apparently been specifically coming back for, closed it, stood at the counter for a moment with her back to him, and he could read from the set of her shoulders that she was deciding whether to say something more, weighing it, concluding she should. She turned around. I know this is hard. It was not actually tender. It had the shape of tenderness but the substance of something else. The kind of thing you said when you needed the other person to understand that you weren't a bad person, that this was simply how it had to be, that the situation required a certain sacrifice, and you were being very adult about it. James is taking me to New York next month. She let that sit for a moment. He has people in the media market up there. He's building something real, Anthony. Something with actual shape to it. I think I just understood too late that I needed to be around that kind of energy. Anthony set his mug down on the table. I hope it works out for you. She looked at him for a half second. The response had the wrong shape. She'd been expecting something with more texture to it. Something she could push back against or use to confirm the story she'd been telling herself about why this was necessary. What she got instead was 4 words delivered with the pleasant neutrality of a man commenting on the weather. A tight, slightly confused smile crossed her face. Then she walked back outside. He watched her finish directing the last of it. She did not look back when the truck pulled away, just walked to her leased Audi, got in, reversed out of the driveway with the same decisive efficiency that had characterized the entire morning, and was gone. Anthony washed his mug, dried it, put it in the cabinet, sat back down at the table, and let the house settle into its new quiet around him. Not the silence of before, which had been the silence of 2 people occupying the same space with increasing distance between them. This was different, simpler, the silence of a defined problem, which was the necessary condition before any problem could be addressed. He had work to do. Harold Reed's office occupied the 12th floor of a building on Peachtree, the kind of office that signaled seriousness without announcing itself. Clean lines and good light and nothing on the walls that wasn't earning its place. Harold had been practicing law for 26 years. He had the deliberate pace of someone who understood that most urgency was manufactured, and most important things could be handled correctly if you simply refused to be rushed. Anthony arrived at 8 on Monday morning. Harold was already there. He had the Vanguard financial reports on the table when Anthony walked in, along with a yellow legal pad covered in his careful handwriting, the kind of notes that went all the way to the margins and had a logical sequence you could follow without asking for help. Anthony sat across from him. Between them was Kathleen Robinson's preliminary audit summary, the compensation file, and a folder that held the 1-page brief Harold had prepared on Wilson Capital's legal standing as controlling partner. Walk me through what you want, Harold said. Full forensic audit through the investor relations channel. Anthony had been thinking through the sequencing since Thursday night. Frame it as routine due diligence. Quarterly review. Wilson Capital sends these requests every 18 months. His team has received one before. Nothing unusual. They won't push back. And the real objective. Anthony tapped the compensation summary once with his index finger. His salary doesn't explain his life. I want to know what does. All of it. Every account, every entity, every transfer. Kathleen found the first layer. I want the full picture. Harold wrote something on his pad. She'll need direct access to the internal ledgers. The audit request gives us that authority. But the request has to come through the standard IR channel with proper documentation. I'll file it today. How long to get access approved? 3 business days. Maybe 2 if his team is cooperative, and they have incentive to appear cooperative. Harold looked up. His team doesn't know what we're looking for. They think this is a routine check from a major investor. That's an advantage. Keep it that way. Harold nodded. Turned a page on his legal pad. The other matter, Vanessa Carter. What did Terry find? Harold set down his pen. This was the part he'd been thinking about most since Friday. Anthony could tell from the way he organized himself before speaking, that specific quality of a man who has been sitting with something and wants to present it without editorializing. She left the Q3 budget review early last Thursday, midway through the agenda. Told the room she had a conflict, which was unusual enough that 3 different people mentioned it to Terry's contact inside the company without being asked. Harold paused. She's been eating lunch alone every day for the past 6 weeks. Before that, she ate with the same 2 colleagues on a regular rotation. The pattern shifted around the same time as the transfer volume inside Blackridge started increasing. Anthony looked at the wall for a moment. She found something. That's my read. The question is what she did with it and where she is with it now. Did she report internally? No record of it. No HR documentation, no compliance flag, nothing in the audit committee minutes. Harold picked his pen back up, which means she either doesn't have enough to feel certain, or she's certain and doesn't know who to take it to, or she's waiting for something she can't name yet, or she's protecting herself. Also possible Harold was honest about it. But if she were protecting herself, she would have left. She's still there, still doing the job, still sitting with whatever she knows. He looked at Anthony. That's not someone who made peace with it. That's someone who hasn't decided what to do yet. Approach her carefully. First meeting is yours, not mine. She doesn't know who I am, and I want to keep it that way until we understand where she stands. If she shuts you down, let her. Leave the door open and wait. And if she doesn't shut me down, then find out exactly what she has and what she wants from this. Anthony leaned back. She's been carrying something for a while. People who carry things alone start looking for somewhere to put them down. We just need to make sure she understands that putting it down with us is the right choice. Harold wrote for a moment. Then, Anthony, whatever happens with the company side of this, how are you thinking about the personal exposure, the divorce proceedings? Anthony had been waiting for this question and had already decided on the answer. Pull the prenuptial agreement. Review it, make sure everything is exactly where we left it, and then tell me we're clean. I've already looked at it. Harold's voice was level. The language covers all assets held under Wilson Capital at signing and all future appreciation. It's properly executed, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and there's no challenge that's going to stick. A pause. She has no claim on the fund. Nothing. Anthony absorbed that, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with the specific feeling of a perimeter being confirmed, the way you felt when you checked a fence line and found it intact. Good, he said. Then let's get to work. The following week moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. On the outside, slow, ordinary. Anthony at his desk by 5:30 every morning. Portfolio calls. The site visit he rescheduled from the week before. A call with his insurance team on a coverage question that had been pending for a month. Dinner at Lorraine's on Wednesday, where she made pot roast with sweet potatoes and did not once ask him how he was doing with everything, which in Lorraine's language meant she was watching closely and giving him room and would say something when the time was right. On the inside, Kathleen Robinson was inside Vanguard's books. She had access as of Tuesday afternoon. Harold had handled the framing. Kathleen had been introduced to Vanguard's accounting team as a senior representative of Wilson Capital's due diligence process. Standard procedure. routine review, nothing to flag. James Carter's team had been cooperative in exactly the way Harold predicted, efficiently helpful, eager to appear organized. The kind of cooperation that came from people who had been told to make a good impression and had no reason to believe the impression they needed to make was anything other than professional. Anthony did not go to the Vanguard offices, did not call anyone there, did not appear in any way connected to what Kathleen was doing. He was, as far as anyone at Vanguard knew, simply the entity name on a quarterly review request, a line item in their investor relations calendar, a process they had gone through before and would go through again. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had built a $480 million fund on the practice of it. The ability to sit with incomplete information and not move prematurely was, in his experience, the single most undervalued skill in his entire industry. Everyone wanted to act. Everyone wanted to be the person who moved first. The people who actually built things that lasted were the ones who could tolerate the discomfort of sitting still while the picture finished developing. He applied that discipline now with the same intention he'd always applied it, and tried not to think about Sandra in a hotel lobby in New York or wherever it was she would be by the time all of this resolved. Harold called on a Thursday afternoon with 2 words, "Call me." Anthony called from the office door locked, before Harold finished the sentence. "You read it, I read it." Harold was using the specific version of his voice, reserved for things that were serious and confirmed. A voice that was level but had a certain weight beneath the levelness, like a river that was calm at the surface. "Kathleen sent it this morning. You need to see the full report, but I'll give you the structure now. Go ahead. Blackridge Advisory Services is the shell. Delaware registration, no physical address, no employees, no evidence of any services rendered to Vanguard in the 16 months of transfer activity. The transfers are consistent and patterned. They start small and scale up over time as the scheme stabilizes and nothing flags. The amounts are timed to sit below automatic reporting thresholds at Vanguard's bank. There's space to fall in the gap between Vanguard's internal review cycles." A pause. Someone understood how the review cycles worked. Someone with access to the audit calendar. That's not his accountant. That's him. Kathleen's language is careful, but the implication is clear. The authorization chain for every transfer traces to his access credentials. There's no ambiguity about that. Another pause. Total across 16 months is $387,000. From 6 client retainer accounts. Money clients paid Vanguard in advance for services not yet delivered. Client retainer funds. The specific kind of money that didn't belong to the company, that existed in trust, that was legally protected in a different category from operating revenue. Anthony understood immediately what that meant in terms of exposure. The downstream spending? Kathleen traced it. Restaurant charges, hotel stays, a jewelry purchase from a boutique in Buckhead, a car service account, a weekend property rental in Savannah that was filed as a vendor relations event. Harold's voice stayed level, but something shifted slightly underneath it. And specific hotel charges at the Harrington, Anthony. 3 of them in the Blackridge transfer records. The dates and amounts are in the documentation. Anthony did not say anything for a moment. He already knew what dates those would be. Could have told Harold without looking. But there was a difference between knowing something and having it confirmed in a signed document by a forensic accountant with 20 years of experience and a court-qualified methodology. And the difference between those 2 things had a specific weight that landed now in the center of his chest and stayed there. $312 in a fraud log, in a document that traced it directly to client money that flowed through accounts ultimately subject to Wilson Capital's controlling interest. The architecture was complete and precise, and so specific that it would have been almost elegant if it weren't so enraging, if rage were the thing he was feeling. Which it was not exactly, which was something more precise than rage, more organized, more cold. "I want the full report on my desk by end of day." His voice was even. "Everything Kathleen has. Every transfer, every account, every receipt. And I want it airtight. Not almost airtight. Courtroom airtight. That's what Kathleen delivers." Harold said it simply. "She'll have the final version to me by tonight." "Good. A beat. And Vanessa Carter. That's the other thing I was going to call about." Harold paused in a way that meant he had something and was thinking about how to present it. I approached her yesterday. Coffee shop placed on the east side, neutral ground. She chose the location herself, which told me something. She was there before I arrived. Anthony waited. She found it 8 months ago. What she described matches the escalating portion of Kathleen's timeline. She said she thought it was an accounting error the first time, and went to James with a question about it. He explained it smoothly. She accepted the explanation, or she told herself she did. Harold's voice had a careful, even quality. The second time she found something, she didn't go to him. She went looking herself, found Blackridge, found the transfer pattern, built her own record of it on a personal encrypted drive, and didn't tell anyone. Why not? It was not a question, not quite. He knew why not. He just wanted to hear how Harold characterized it. She said she didn't know who to trust inside the organization. Said James had a way of making you feel like your evidence was never quite complete enough, never quite certain enough, that you needed just one more piece before you could say anything definitive. Harold paused. She's been waiting for what she called the right door. Did she shut you down? No. A beat. She brought documentation to the meeting, Anthony. She had it with her. 4 pages, handwritten notes, cross-referenced with specific account numbers. She wasn't waiting to see what we had. She was waiting to see if we were the right place to take what she had. Anthony looked at the window. The afternoon light was coming through the frosted glass at a low angle, casting a pale stripe across the floor. Set up a meeting, he said. The 3 of us, before the end of the week. She's agreed. She wants assurance about her own exposure first. Tell her Kathleen's review shows no participation on her part in any of the transfer activity. Tell her Harold Reed, as legal counsel for the controlling investor, is prepared to provide a formal letter to that effect. And tell her what we need from her is a signed statement and willingness to appear before the board. I'll call her today, and Harold. Anthony looked at the stripe of light on the floor for a moment. There's one more thing I found. In Kathleen's report, cross-reference it for me. Page 6, Section 3, the itemized hotel transfers. A pause. Papers moving. Then Harold was quiet in a different way, a reading quiet. Then Anthony. I know. Another pause. This doesn't just give you standing as controlling investor. It gives you direct personal standing. The money used for those charges flows from client retainer funds through Blackridge to his personal account, to a hotel that is in the timeline of the investigation, into his wife's. Harold stopped himself. Into the personal matter. I know what it is, Anthony said. I'm not sure you need the personal standing given the investor standing, but having both, I know, Harold. His voice was still even. That's why the timing matters. I need everything ready before the investor dinner. A brief silence. The quarterly dinner. Yes. He sent the invitation to the fund address. He doesn't know you're the person behind Wilson Capital. That's correct. Harold was quiet for a moment, working through the specific geometry of it. So he's invited the entity that controls his company to a dinner, celebrating his company's performance, without knowing that entity is the husband of the woman he's been taking to hotels on stolen money. That's correct. A pause that had a very particular quality. When do you want to confirm attendance? Today, Anthony said. Generic confirmation, fund letterhead, my name does not appear. 1 representative attending. Standard language. Nothing that would stand out. And you're attending yourself. Yes. Harold took a moment. Then he moved into the register he used for logistics. The voice that meant he had accepted the situation and was now simply focused on executing it correctly. I'll confirm today. I'll also need Vanessa confirmed before that dinner. Her statement signed and notarized. And I need the board notification filed 48 hours in advance per the operating agreement. File the board notification the moment Vanessa's statement is signed. That puts the notification window tight against the dinner. That's where I want it. Anthony stood up from his desk and moved to the window. The city below was doing its afternoon thing, ordinary and indifferent. One more thing. Sandra will be there. She'll receive the standard marketing leadership invitation. She has no reason not to attend. I know. Silence between them, the kind that didn't need filling. Anthony. Harold's voice shifted back into that careful horizontal register. Are you certain about walking into that room? Anthony looked down at the street. A delivery truck. A woman walking a dog. 2 men in suits coming out of the building, across the way. I've been certain about very few things in the last month, he said. This is one of them. Harold introduced Vanessa Carter on a Friday evening. They met at Harold's office. Not the coffee shop this time. This was the kind of meeting that needed walls and a door, and the specific gravity of a conference table with documents on it. Vanessa arrived 2 minutes early. She wore a dark coat over a gray blazer, and she had the composed, upright posture of someone who had been living with something heavy for a long time, and had developed very good physical habits to compensate for the internal weight of it. Her eyes moved across the room when she entered, taking in Harold, taking in Anthony, calculating. She knew who Anthony was before she sat down. He could tell from the way she looked at him, not with surprise but with the particular recognition of someone encountering an answer they had already begun to suspect. Harold opened the first folder. The meeting had a structure, which was Harold's natural habitat. He went through it in sequence, the same way he always organized complexity, one piece at a time, no shortcuts, no assumptions that anyone was tracking without confirmation. Kathleen's audit findings first, the full picture, Blackridge, the 16 months, the $387,000, the itemized downstream spending. Vanessa listened without interrupting. She had the quality of someone who was not hearing this for the first time, but was hearing it fully assembled for the first time, which was a different experience. She had built her own partial version. This was the complete version. And the difference between what she'd built and what Kathleen had built from the outside told her something she couldn't have known from her position alone. This was airtight. This had the kind of completeness that didn't leave room for creative accounting explanations. When Harold stopped speaking, Vanessa was quiet for a moment. I want something on the record, she said. Her voice was steady, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this part. I am the CFO of this company. I found the first irregularity in April of last year. I questioned it. I was given an explanation I chose to accept, because I didn't have enough at that point to know whether my instinct was right or whether I was seeing something that wasn't there. She looked at Harold. That was a mistake in judgment. It was not participation in the scheme. Kathleen's review of the transfer authorization chains confirms that your access credentials appear nowhere in the activity. Harold said it without ceremony. We've prepared a letter to that effect. Vanessa absorbed that. Something in her shoulders shifted by a fraction, the barely visible release of a tension that had been there for 8 months. Then she reached into the bag beside her chair and produced a folder. Not thin. It had the weight of something that had been added to, over time. Pages, accumulated gradually. A record built in secret with the discipline of someone who understood the value of documentation even when she wasn't sure what she was documenting it for. She placed it on the table. Harold opened it. Anthony watched his face. Harold was good at not reacting to things, but something moved behind his eyes when he got 4 pages in. This is internal, Harold said. This is from inside the accounting system. I have CFO access, Vanessa said. Everything in there is from my own direct observation. Account numbers, dates, the specific variances I flagged internally, and the corresponding explanations I received, documented at the time. A pause, and something else. She looked at Anthony for the first time since she'd sat down. Directly. The way she'd been thinking about this part and had decided to address it straight on rather than building to it. There was a woman before Sandra. She said the name without hesitation. Her name was Angela Young. She was a senior account manager at Vanguard 3 years ago. James had a relationship with her. Same pattern. Same promises. He told her he would end his marriage, that he would take care of her, that she had a future at the company. A pause. When Angela started asking questions about some unusual expense approvals she'd noticed in documents she had routine access to, her position was eliminated in a restructure 3 weeks later. The room was quiet. She's in Houston now, Vanessa said. I've never spoken to her directly, but I know 2 people who have, and the story they describe is the same story, down to the specific language he used. She looked at her hands for a moment. He does this. That's what I need you to understand. This isn't an anomaly. This is a pattern that works because no single person inside the organization ever has enough of the full picture to do anything about it. He depends on the isolation. Anthony looked at the folder she'd placed on the table. He thought about Angela Young in Houston. carrying something she couldn't prove. Watching from a distance as the same thing continued happening to someone else, who also didn't have the full picture. He thought about isolation as a system. Deliberate, structured, maintained by the specific architecture of incomplete information. He had understood for weeks that James Carter was a fraud. He understood now that he was also something more calculated than that. A man who had built his entire life around managing what other people knew and when they knew it, and who was careful enough to make sure no single person ever accumulated enough to constitute a real threat until now. "What I need from you," Anthony said, "is a signed statement. Everything you've told us tonight, everything in that folder, organized and dated and notarized." He looked at her steadily, "And I need you willing to appear before the board." Vanessa met his eyes. "I've been waiting 8 months for the right door." "This is the door." She nodded once, "Then I'll walk through it." The night before the dinner, Harold's conference room, 9:15 p.m. 3 folders on the table. Kathleen's audit report, signed and notarized. Vanessa's statement, signed and notarized. The prenuptial agreement, retrieved from Harold's firm's secure storage, dated and witnessed correctly. Vanessa sat across from them. She had reviewed everything twice and had no changes. Harold had walked through the board notification filing, submitted 48 hours prior, per the operating agreement, triggering the mandatory emergency session authority that Wilson Capital held as controlling partner. The confirmation had come back within an hour. Raymond Harris, the board chair, had been reached by phone. Harold described that call in 2 sentences. Raymond Harris had listened without interrupting. When Harold finished, Harris had said, "Thank you for bringing this through the proper channel, and nothing else," which told you everything you needed to know about Raymond Harris. Anthony went through each folder in the order they would be presented. He turned pages without rushing, took his time with the ones that mattered. When he reached page 6 of Kathleen's report, the one with the itemized hotel charges, he looked at it for a moment longer than the rest and then turned the page. Harold watched him. "We're ready," Harold said. Anthony closed the last folder. He looked at the table for a moment, then at Harold, then at Vanessa, who had the composed, slightly drawn quality of someone who had spent 8 months being careful and was about to stop being careful, and who was sitting with that transition in the particular way people sat with things that could not be undone. "She'll be there," Anthony said. "Not a question. She received the marketing leadership invitation 3 days ago," Harold said. "Standard communication from James's assistant. No reason for her not to attend." Anthony nodded. Lorraine had called him that afternoon. Not about any of this. She'd called to say she was making chicken and dumplings Sunday and she expected him there. He'd said he'd be there. She'd said, "Good," and then she'd said, "You know, your father had this quality about him. He never raised his voice when things were hard. I used to think that was distance. It took me years to understand it was something else entirely." She didn't say what the something else was. She didn't need to. He thought about that now in the quiet of the conference room. He thought about Sandra directing movers through the front door with the efficiency of someone whose life was already somewhere else. About the trunk of the Audi disappearing around the corner without a backward look. About 14 years of a kitchen table, and a fence that needed painting, and a truck with a rust spot, and a little office at the end of the hall. He thought about $290,000, and a black Porsche Cayenne that the salary didn't produce, and a hotel room that cost $312 and appeared in a fraud log as a line item under falsified client entertainment expenses. He thought about Angela Young in Houston, waiting for something she couldn't name. He buttoned his jacket. The same jacket he'd worn for the last 15 years of days that never looked like anything from the outside. Charcoal gray, single button. Nothing remarkable about it. He did not need the jacket to say anything on his behalf. "Tomorrow," he said. Harold was already closing his briefcase. Vanessa was putting on her coat, her face set with the particular resolve of someone who had made a decision and was done deliberating. Anthony picked up his copy of the documentation, tucked it under his arm. He looked at Harold. "Let's go remind him whose company he actually works for." Word count, 6,831 climax seeds. Board dinner tension. Vanessa reveal. Angela Young pattern. Sandra convergence quote-worthy lines embedded. 5 all scenes Atlanta. Only 0 recaps of future parts. 0 repeated sentences from Part 1. The Meridian Club occupied the top 2 floors of a building on West Peachtree that had been there long enough to have outlasted 3 different versions of the neighborhood around it. The lobby had high ceilings and warm light, and the specific quiet of a place where significant things happened regularly, and the staff had been trained to treat that as unremarkable. Anthony walked in at 6:58. 2 minutes early, a habit so old he'd stopped thinking of it as a choice. The charcoal suit, black shoes, plain, no detail work, no tie. His phone in his jacket pocket, and a small identification card in his breast pocket that named him as Anthony Wilson, managing partner, Wilson Capital Partners. Harold walked beside him, briefcase in hand, moving with the measured pace of a man who had been in important rooms his whole adult life and had stopped finding them impressive. The welcome table was staffed by a young woman with a practiced smile and a clipboard. Anthony gave her his name. She found it, and something shifted slightly in the efficiency of her attention, the particular adjustment that happened when a name on a list had been flagged as requiring extra care. "Of course, Mr. Wilson. Right this way." The event space was through a set of double doors that opened into a long room dressed for the occasion. Round tables with white linen, centerpieces low enough not to block sight lines, a bar set up along the back wall where 2 people in dark jackets were moving with quiet precision. The light was warm and intentional, the kind of lighting that made everyone look slightly better than they actually felt. 45, maybe 50 people. Board members and senior investors clustered near the front, Vanguard's executive team occupying a middle zone. And along the outer tables, the marketing and creative leadership staff. People who had been invited as a gesture, an acknowledgement that the company valued them enough to include them in the annual performance celebration. Sandra was at one of those outer tables. Anthony saw her the moment he cleared the doorway. She was seated with 3 colleagues, her body angled toward the woman beside her, mid-conversation, a glass of white wine in her hand. She was wearing a black dress he had not seen before, and earrings larger than she usually wore, gold catching the light when she moved. She was laughing at something, fully, without reservation. The laugh of a woman who felt comfortable in the room she was in. She had not looked toward the door. Anthony kept walking, steady pace, eyes forward. He did not slow down as he passed the table's peripheral range, did not let his gaze linger. Moved with the particular kind of purposefulness that made people instinctively give you a path. He found his assigned seat at the head table, sat down, opened the water glass in front of him and drank. James Carter was holding court near the center of the room. He stood with 3 board members, bourbon in his right hand, his body in the relaxed, expansive posture of a man who believed this room existed to confirm things he already knew about himself. He was telling a story. The board members were giving him the thing he was looking for, which was attentive laughter, and he was calibrating the story's length to produce more of it. The suit was navy, custom, or something close to it. The fit said, tailored by someone who understood shoulders. His cufflinks caught light in the way cufflinks did when they had been selected specifically to catch light in rooms like this one. He looked exactly like what he had sold Sandra he was. Anthony watched him for a moment, the way you watched a document before you signed it, taking in the full picture before committing. James's assistant, a young man named Khalil, who had sent the original dinner invitation, touched James's elbow and leaned in. James half-turned in the middle of his sentence. His eyes moved across the room and found Anthony's face. The expression that followed was fast and layered. Recognition. Confusion that arrived behind the recognition, because the face matched a name on a list, but the name on the list was a fund, not a person. And the architecture of James Carter's carefully constructed life depended on those 2 things remaining separate. Then a third thing, brief and quickly covered. The specific sensation of a man who has just understood that the ground he thought was solid has something wrong with it. The bourbon dropped 2 inches in his hand. He caught it, smiled, crossed the room. "Mr. Wilson." The handshake was firm and slightly too extended, the grip of a man using the physical contact to re-establish the footing he'd just lost. "James Carter. This is a genuine pleasure. I have to say, we weren't expecting you personally." "I know," Anthony said. James waited for more. Nothing came. He produced a laugh, smooth and practiced. Well, welcome. This is a good evening for Vanguard. Really glad you could join us in person for once. I'm sure you are, Anthony said. Mild. Factual. He moved past James toward the head table, and he felt James's eyes following him the entire length of the room. The dinner progressed in its normal shape. Courses came and went. Conversation moved through the standard channels. Company performance, market conditions, the cautious optimism that characterized business dinners, when the news had been generally positive. And no one wanted to be the person who introduced a darker note. Anthony ate. He answered questions from the two board members seated nearest to him with the calm precision he brought to any professional conversation, saying enough to be substantive and nothing beyond what was necessary. He was pleasant. He was unremarkable. He was exactly the kind of investor presence that made finance events go smoothly. A person who understood the room without needing to dominate it. James watched him. From across the room, from over the rim of his glass, through the polite screens of other conversations. Anthony felt the surveillance the way you felt weather, not through any single data point, but through a general change in atmosphere. James was trying to read him, trying to determine from the angle of his body and the expression on his face and the way he held his fork what exactly Anthony Wilson knew and how much of it was a problem. He would not find those answers in Anthony's face. Anthony had been trained by years of negotiation and counterparty management never to put information in his face that he had not decided to put there. At the outer tables, Sandra was on her second glass of wine. The conversation at her table had shifted. She was leaning back now, more relaxed. The way people got at dinners once the first course settled and the room felt warmer. She had not looked toward the head table once, which meant she hadn't recognized him yet, or hadn't looked closely enough to register what she was seeing. In a different context, at a work event, in a room full of professional associations, Anthony Wilson did not automatically compute as her husband. He computed as someone who belonged at the head table, which, tonight, he did. 8:15. Raymond Harris rose to open the program. Raymond Harris was 62 and built like someone who had played competitive sports in his youth and had continued doing something physical every decade since. He had the compact, deliberate authority of a man who chaired boards because he understood them structurally, not because he wanted the title. When he stood, the room adjusted toward him without being asked. Good evening. He had the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry. Before we move to our company update, I want to acknowledge a few of our key partners who joined us tonight. He worked through the list, acknowledged 2 institutional investors by name. Mentioned Wilson Capital last, with a slight adjustment in register, a small inflection of particular weight that the people in this room who knew how to read boards would have caught. James was already shifting forward in his chair. This was the part of the evening he'd been building toward. The performance review, the numbers, the forward guidance, his room. He was halfway out of his chair. Raymond. Anthony's voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never needed volume to be heard. Wilson Capital has a matter to bring to the board's attention before the update. If you'll allow a few minutes, the room held. Raymond Harris looked at Anthony, looked at Harold, who was already standing, briefcase open, folders in hand. Raymond Harris was not a man who showed surprise in his face, but something moved through his eyes, quick and assessing, and what came out the other side was the expression of someone who had just understood that the evening had a different shape than the one on the program. He sat back down. James Carter's chair did not complete its motion. He settled back into it the way a person sat when they were trying to decide in real time whether to pretend they'd never stood up at all. Anthony rose. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He spoke the way he moved through every significant thing in his life, with the measured, sequential clarity of someone who had assembled the full picture before he said a single word, and was now simply allowing other people to see what he'd been looking at. Blackridge Advisory Services LLC. Delaware registration, no physical address, no employees, no evidence of any service rendered to Vanguard Creative Group in the 16 months during which Vanguard's financial records showed payments made to it. The documentation was in the folders Harold placed in front of Raymond Harris and the 2 board members beside him. 16 months. 192 transfers of varying amounts, each structured to remain below automatic reporting thresholds, each timed to fall within the gap between Vanguard's internal audit cycles. Total, $387,000, from 6 client retainer accounts. Money belonging to clients, held in trust. The authorization chain on every single transfer traced to one set of access credentials. He placed the audit report summary on the table. Kathleen Robinson's name, her qualifications, her methodology and certification, all present and notarized. Then Vanessa Carter stood. She'd been seated at a side table for the entire dinner, visible but unremarkable, a senior company executive at a company event. Nobody had looked at her twice. Now she stood, and the room noticed her the way rooms notice unexpected movement in the middle of stillness. She spoke for 4 minutes, no notes, account numbers, dates, the specific internal records she had accessed in her capacity as CFO, the timeline of her own discovery, the April variance that she'd initially accepted an explanation for, the second irregularity 3 months later that she had not accepted an explanation for, the 8 months of quiet documentation that followed. She described the Blackridge transfer pattern from the inside, the view available only to someone with direct access to the internal ledger, and the picture she described was identical to the picture Kathleen had assembled from the outside. 2 independent approaches, 1 result. Her voice was steady from the first word to the last. The specific steadiness of someone who had been waiting a long time for the moment they were allowed to tell the truth, and had decided that when it came, they would not waste it by being anything less than completely clear. The room had gone the kind of quiet that had texture to it. The quiet of 45 people holding their collective breath without having coordinated to do so. James Carter stood. He stopped. Started again. These figures are taken out of context. There is an internal accounting matter that is being addressed through proper channels. Blackridge is a legitimate consulting relationship and the documentation. Anthony said, and his voice had the quality of a door closing, not loud. Just final. Shows transfers from 6 client retainer accounts into an entity with no physical address, no employees, and no record of services rendered, with those funds subsequently transferred into a personal account registered in your name. The complete transfer log is in front of the board right now. James opened his mouth. Raymond Harris raised his right hand. He did not look at James when he did it. He was looking at the documents in front of him, turning pages with the deliberate attention of a man who was reading for comprehension, rather than performance. His 2 fellow board members were doing the same, and the low murmur between them was the sound of people who had spent careers making consequential decisions and recognized the specific shape of one now. The conversation between them lasted less than 5 minutes. Raymond Harris looked up. Effective immediately, he said. Mr. Carter is suspended from all executive functions pending a full forensic review of the financial matters presented this evening. This suspension is consistent with Wilson Capital's rights as controlling partner and the emergency provisions of Vanguard's operating agreement. Mr. Carter will be escorted from the premises. A full board session will be convened within 48 hours. James's voice climbed past the register he'd been holding. You can't do this. This is my company. I built this from— It isn't, Anthony said. Quiet. Not cruel. Simply accurate. 51% controlling interest. Wilson Capital Partners. The filing date is June 2020. You've known that since you joined the company. James looked at Anthony across the room, with the specific expression of a man watching an exit he believed was available close in front of him. 2 men in dark jackets appeared at the back of the room. Not security in any aggressive sense. Just presence, size, the physical fact of people who were there for a purpose and understood their purpose. James was still talking as they moved toward him, still explaining, still constructing the version of the story he needed the room to accept, his voice getting louder as the room's silence made the loudness more obvious. He was using the voice of a man who believed volume could compensate for what accuracy could not do, that if he just kept insisting the room would eventually come around. The room did not come around. He was guided toward the door with a particular efficiency of people who had done this before in other rooms, with other men who had made similar calculations and reached similar ends. And it was in that motion, In the moment when the room's collective attention taut James Carter's exit across the length of the space, that Sandra finally looked toward the front of the room. She had been watching James. She'd been watching since the volume climbed, since the words fraud and suspended, and 51%, had started organizing themselves in the air of the room into a shape she could not yet interpret, but that her body was already responding to, a tightening in her chest, a specific alertness that was not understanding yet, but was the warning system that preceded understanding. And then her eyes moved forward, past the board table, past Harold with his briefcase, past Vanessa standing composed at the side wall, all the way to the man at the front of the room in the charcoal suit, the man who had said it isn't in a voice she had heard say other things, softer things, smaller things, morning things across a kitchen table in a house, with a fence that needed painting. Sandra. Her wine glass was still in her hand. She stood, not with purpose yet, with the reflexive motion of someone whose nervous system had issued an instruction before her mind had finished forming the thought. She moved through the space between tables, the room parting for her the way rooms parted for visible emotional weather. People stepping back not out of courtesy, but out of the instinct to give space to something that had velocity. She stopped 6 feet from the board table. Her voice came out louder than she'd planned. Anthony. The name landed in the room's silence like something dropped. What is going on? Why are you up here? He looked at her. Not with cruelty. Not with the satisfaction of a man who had waited for this moment and was now savoring it. He looked at her the way he looked at most things, with the level, complete attention of someone who was fully present and had already decided what needed to be said. Why are you standing there like that? She looked at Harold, at Vanessa, at the board members, her eyes moving the way eyes moved when they were trying to find information faster than it was arriving. What is this? How do you know these people? Sit down, Sandra. Don't tell me to. She stopped herself, lowered her voice by a fraction, stepped closer. What are you doing here? How do you even have access to any of this? Anthony picked up the identification card from the table beside him. He held it so she could read it clearly. Anthony Wilson. Wilson Capital Partners. She stared at it. He set it back down. Wilson Capital Partners owns 51% of Vanguard Creative Group, he said. Has for 4 years. The company you work for. The company James Carter has been running into the ground, while presenting you with a version of himself that his actual salary could not produce. Sandra's mouth opened, closed. Something behind her eyes was working very hard to catch up to what her ears were receiving, and the gap between the two was visible on her face in a way she could not control. That's not, she shook her head. You never asked. He said it without accusation. Simply, the way he said things that were true and needed to be said out loud. 14 years. You looked at the truck and the house and the office and you decided what the story was and you never asked if the story was right. A slight lift in her chin. Old reflex. The posture of a woman who had been preparing counter-arguments her whole life. You never told me. You're right. He did not let that cost him anything. Did not use it as a weapon. Just acknowledged it the way he'd acknowledged it to himself in the dark of his office weeks ago. That's something I'll have to sit with. I kept too much from you and I called it not needing to explain myself, and those two things are not the same. And I know that now. She was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Something stripped down. The careful construction she maintained in rooms like this, the professional composure, the social fluency. It had all slipped sideways and underneath it was just Sandra, 40 years old, standing in a room full of people who knew things she hadn't known, holding a wine glass she'd forgotten was in her hand. The hotels, Anthony said. The dinners, the jewelry, the promise of New York and the promise of taking care of you, and the promise of everything he said he was going to do when he finally ended his marriage. He looked at her steadily. All of it came from client retainer accounts at this company. Money that belonged to the people who trusted him with it. That documentation is in front of the board right now. Every charge, every transfer. Traced and verified, a beat. He let it sit. The Harrington Hotel, Sandra, $312. A Thursday night. His voice was even and quiet and carried across the distance between them with perfect clarity. It's in the fraud log. Traced to a client account through a shell company. Paid for with money that flows through Wilson Capital's controlling stake. Another beat. He used my money to take you to that hotel room. The wine glass was hanging at her side now, almost forgotten, held by the same automatic grip that kept people from dropping things when they had stopped thinking about what their hands were doing. The room held its breath. Raymond Harris sat motionless at the board table. The two other board members had stopped pretending to look at documents. Every person in the space had the particular stillness of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be described later in careful, incomplete language to people who hadn't been there. The prenuptial agreement you signed in 2010 is valid and enforceable, Anthony continued. Harold has reviewed it within the last 10 days. Wilson Capital is fully protected. Our attorneys will be in contact with yours to walk through the specifics. He paused. You have no claim on the fund. Nothing in 14 years of marriage changed that. Not legally. Sandra blinked. The thing behind her eyes that had been trying to catch up finally arrived somewhere. Not at understanding, not yet, but at the specific recognition that the story she had been living inside for the last several months had a different shape than the one she'd believed she was in, and that she was standing in a room full of people who could all see the shape clearly, and she was the only one who had not. Her voice came out thin. Anthony, I hope you find what you're looking for. He meant it plainly. Not as a weapon, not as a closing statement in a performance, as a fact about his own wishes, which had not changed simply because the situation had. I genuinely do. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned back to the board table. Raymond Harris looked at Anthony with the clean, direct attention of a man who understood what had just happened and what it required. The board has everything it needs. Harold will remain available for any follow-up within the scope of the investor rights provisions. Thank you, Raymond. Anthony gathered his copy of the documentation, set his chair in. He walked toward the door. He did not look back. The glass doors of the Meridian Club caught his reflection for 1 second as he pushed through them. Behind him, the room was visible in the glass, still in its strange held stillness, and Sandra was standing exactly where he'd left her. In the middle of 45 people who all knew the full picture now, holding a wine glass at her side. He walked out into the Atlanta night and the door closed behind him. The story broke on a Tuesday. By Wednesday it was in 3 industry newsletters and a regional business publication, whose headline read, CEO suspended amid embezzlement investigation. By Thursday the word suspended had been updated to terminated. By the following week the language had progressed further, and the specificity had increased, and people in Atlanta's media and marketing community were learning details they found easier to discuss than to sit with quietly. Anthony read none of it twice. He already knew the numbers. He'd handed the criminal referral packet to the district attorney's office the morning after the board meeting, and Harold had filed the civil claims before noon. The rest of it, the public unraveling, the forwarded articles, the second-hand accounts of conversations happening in offices he'd never been in, was just the world catching up to something he'd confirmed weeks ago in a quiet room. With a spreadsheet and a mug of coffee that had gone cold, James Carter's wife filed for divorce 11 days after the board meeting. There were photographs of him leaving the Vanguard building with a cardboard box, taken by someone with a phone and poor timing. Those photographs spread further than any of the written coverage. Anthony saw one of them once, by accident, when a colleague sent a news link about the Wilson Capital audit. He looked at it for a moment. James in a parking lot with the sun in his eyes and a box under one arm, and felt nothing that had an edge to it, just the flat, settled feeling of something that was finished. He closed the tab, went back to work. Vanguard Creative Group did not survive the investigation intact. 3 of its largest clients pulled contracts within the first 30 days. A 4th followed when Vanessa's testimony became part of the public record. The company's board, meeting in a series of sessions over the following 6 weeks, voted to restructure under new leadership brought in through a process Wilson Capital oversaw. The interim director was someone Anthony had worked with briefly in a previous deal, competent and steady and disinclined to the kinds of performance that had made James Carter so effective at appearing impressive. It was not the outcome Anthony had envisioned when he'd acquired the stake 4 years ago. He'd seen growth potential and reasonable management and a serviceable platform. What he'd gotten instead was a fraud, a restructuring. and the particular professional cost of having a company that would take 18 months to return to the trajectory it should have been on. He absorbed that, filed it under the category of outcomes that were not avoidable once the underlying facts were what they were, and outcomes in that category required acceptance rather than dwelling. Vanessa kept her position. She had earned it in the most direct way possible, by being the person inside the organization who had found the problem and documented it and held it carefully until she understood how to put it somewhere it could be used correctly. That kind of competence was worth more than whatever disruption the transition cost. He told her that directly in a brief meeting the week after the board session. She said, "I didn't do it for recognition." He said, "I know. That's why I'm saying it." The divorce was finalized on a gray Thursday in November. Anthony sat across a conference table from Sandra's attorney, Harold beside him, the executed prenuptial agreement, and the asset division documentation organized in 3 folders between them. Sandra sat beside her attorney. She did not look at Anthony when she came in. He did not look at her except when the conversation required it. Her attorney had reviewed the prenuptial agreement thoroughly and come back with no viable challenge. The language was clean, properly executed, independently witnessed. Wilson Capital was untouched. The marital property, the house, the shared accounts, the items accumulated over 14 years of ordinary living, was divided according to the terms they'd agreed to a long time ago, before either of them knew what the next 14 years would look like. Sandra signed where indicated. Anthony signed where indicated. Neither of them said anything that wasn't procedurally necessary. When it was over, Sandra stood and put on her coat and picked up her bag and walked out of the room without looking back. And Anthony thought about the way she'd left the house on the morning of the movers with the same quality of forward motion, always moving toward the next thing, never backward. He shook the opposing attorney's hand, exchanged a few professional words with Harold, collected his copy of the executed documents. He went down to the street and got in his truck and drove 3 blocks to a diner he'd been going to since he was 30 and ordered eggs and toast and black coffee and read through a prospectus he'd been meaning to finish for a week. The coffee went cold before he got to the end of it. He left a good tip and drove back to the office and worked until 7. The call came 7 weeks after the board dinner, a Thursday afternoon, his phone showing an unknown number with a Houston area code. Anthony answered on the second ring. "Mr. Wilson." The voice was a woman's, careful and measured with the specific quality of someone who had thought about making this call for a while and had decided what she was going to say before she dialed. "My name is Angela Young. I think you might know who I am." He sat back in his chair. "I know who you are." A pause. "I heard about what happened at Vanguard, what you found, what you did with it." She stopped for a moment. "I'm not calling to ask for anything. I just..." Another pause, shorter. "I needed to say thank you to someone who was actually there, who actually did something." Anthony looked at the window. The afternoon was clear in Atlanta, pale winter light at a low angle. He thought about a woman in Houston who had found something 3 years ago that she couldn't prove, and had watched the same pattern continue from a distance and had not been able to do anything about it, except carry the knowledge of it. "Thank you for calling," he said. "What happened to you shouldn't have happened. What he did to your career should not have happened. I'm sorry I couldn't have gotten there sooner." A silence. Then, "You got there." He heard in those 3 words the specific weight of something that had been sitting somewhere without anywhere to go, and had finally found a place to land. "I did," he said. Angela Young thanked him and said goodbye, and the call ended. Anthony held his phone in his hand for a moment and looked at it. He thought about the architecture of what James Carter had built, the careful management of isolation, the system that depended on no single person ever having enough of the picture to constitute a real threat. And he thought about how many people could hold pieces of a thing for years without anyone assembling them into something that mattered, until someone did. He set his phone on the desk and went back to the prospectus. 3 months after the board dinner, on a Saturday afternoon in late winter, Anthony drove to his mother's house. Lorraine met him at the door before he knocked. She had a way of knowing when his truck turned onto her street, some internal system that defied the practical explanation. She pulled him inside and fed him more food than he asked for, a practice she had maintained for as long as he could remember, and they sat at the kitchen table, while the light changed outside the window, the specific quality of late afternoon in February, thin and clear and honest in the way of light that had nowhere to hide. After the dishes were done, they moved to the porch. The neighborhood had the particular quiet of a winter Saturday, people inside or somewhere else. Only the occasional sound of a car passing or a door closing down the block. The sky was going from pale blue to the early gray of evening. A child somewhere on the next street was making a noise of pure, uncomplicated happiness about something. Lorraine sat with her glass of iced tea and looked out at the street for a while. Then she said, "You know what I never told you? Probably many things." She made the small sound that was almost a laugh, her version of it, compressed and warm. When you were young, maybe 12, 13, you would get knocked down by something and you would just go quiet. And I used to sit with that, worry about it. I thought, that boy needs to learn to make noise, needs to learn that the silence swallows you if you let it. Anthony was watching a bird on the telephone wire across the street. But then I watched you for 40 more years, Lorraine continued, and I started to understand something different. The silence wasn't swallowing you. It was something you were doing on purpose. It was how you worked, how you waited, how you built things. She set her glass down on the arm of her chair. I had it backwards the whole time. Anthony turned that over. He looked at the street and thought about a hotel charge on a laptop screen at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, about a cap table that solved a problem he hadn't known he was looking at, about a woman standing in a room full of people who all knew things she hadn't known, holding a wine glass she'd forgotten was in her hand, about a voice from Houston on a Thursday afternoon, saying 3 words with the weight of 3 years in them. He thought about what his mother had just said, and what it meant about the difference between patience and isolation, between the discipline of waiting and the mistake of withholding, and how those two things had lived inside him for a long time, without sufficient separation between them. The silence, he said slowly, it wasn't the problem, but I used it for the wrong things sometimes. Lorraine looked at him. I kept things from Sandra because I thought I didn't need to explain myself to anyone, he continued. I called that self-sufficiency for 14 years, but at some point it became something else, a wall I'd built so carefully I'd stopped being able to see it. Lorraine picked her glass back up, said nothing, giving him room to finish what he was finding. She should have asked, he said. She should have asked 100 times and she didn't, and that cost both of us. But I should have opened a door somewhere in 14 years, and I didn't open it either, and those two failures are different, but they both happened. Yes, Lorraine said, just the one word, not relieving him of anything, not amplifying it either, just confirming, yes, that's what it was. The sky had gone fully gray now. That particular dusk gray of winter evenings in Atlanta, soft and without drama. The child's sound from the next street had stopped. A car passed with its headlights on. The patience was real, Lorraine said finally. The patience was always the whole thing. I don't take that back. She looked at him. But strength isn't the same as solitude. You know that now. He sat with that. He sat with the specific feeling of a thing he had been carrying for a long time arriving at a place where it could rest. Not resolved, not finished, those were the wrong words for it. More like located. Set down somewhere you could see it clearly instead of just feeling its weight. He thought about what came next. Not about Sandra. Not about James Carter in a parking lot with a cardboard box. Not about the restructure at Vanguard or the fraud case, working its way through the DA's office, or any of the procedural aftermath that would continue unfolding on its own schedule. He thought about what kind of person he was going to be when he walked back into his life. The house with the fence that still needed painting, the truck with the rust spot, the office at the end of the hall where $480 million moved through the world in quiet, patient motion that most people would never know about unless they looked. The coffee at 5:17 in the morning before the neighborhood woke up. Those things were still there. They had not changed, but something else had shifted. Something internal and difficult to name precisely. The way a weight you've been carrying changes when you finally understand what it actually is. You don't put it down, you just carry it differently. You know what it is, and knowing what it is makes it possible to decide what to do with it, which was different from just moving through the world with it in silence, which was what he had been doing, well, and with great discipline, for a very long time. "I'll be fine," Anthony said. Lorraine nodded once, the specific nod of a woman who had known that and had been waiting for him to get there. The evening settled around them, gray and cold and very still. Somewhere down the block somebody turned a porch light on, the small yellow square of it against the winter dark. Anthony looked at his hands resting on the arms of the chair, steady. As they had always been, he breathed. The night came on in the way night came, without announcing itself, just arriving steadily until it was there, and the two of them sat on the porch. In the quiet that passed between people who knew each other well enough not to fill it, and the street held its winter stillness around them, and it was enough. It was exactly enough.